Where We're From highlights the rich textures, histories, and experiences of the Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi American community. Each episode is produced by students at San Jose State University.
Hello to our wonderful podcast listeners. Welcome back to another episode with the BMW crew. We have your usual hosts, Taylor, Diana, Mariah, Jason, and yours truly, Ray. In this episode titled Echoes of the Same Narrative, we'll be going over current events and seeing if much has changed in recent years in terms of anti-Asian American rhetoric, comparing it to the events during the Rock Springs Massacre. Mind starting us off, Taylor?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Ray. I just wanted to go back to our previous episode about the Rock Springs Massacre. We have seen the devastating impact on Chinese Americans, where they have barely any food, a place to stay, or money. Because of this, they were willing to work for low wages to provide for their families, which upsetted the white miners because since they went on strikes for higher wages. This led to the massacre of Chinese Americans, all because of white people who believed it was their right to work in the coal mines and that Chinese Americans were there to take their jobs.
Adding more into what Taylor mentioned, the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885 was a very tragic event that took place because of the major hatred between Chinese American workers and white workers. During this time, it was very known that Chinese American workers and white workers were in competition with one another for the fight for a job. This led to a major separation between them, and they did not get along. There were no compromises between them during the fights for jobs. It was just pure anger and competition. Fast forwarding to the present we live in now, there have been similar events where it so happens that Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, etc. have been victims of violence, hatred, and in some cases murdered.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on to what Taylor said about the impact. Some of the reasons for hostility towards Chinese miners were economic concerns and ingrained prejudice. Chinese miners were often scapegoated for taking jobs and living down wages, even though they were filling roles that others refused to take. This was seen as a threat towards white miners, which they saw as a way to justify violence. Nowadays, we see similar connections of scapegoating, an example including Asian Americans in the IT industry were blamed for layoffs in 2023 after being suspected of stealing jobs. Regardless for the medium through which this speech is spread, the core idea of foreigners taking jobs remain unchanged. I guess the question for the listeners would be, why, in your opinion, do these harmful stereotypes still persist rather than focusing on the real systemic issues?
That is a good question. It does feel like these types of words and rhetoric does more harm than good. And speaking of which, we still see these sorts of things happening today. In fact, according to some sources, we are still experiencing heightened levels of anti-Asian American crimes, with a slew of alarming evidence supporting this idea. Notably, as mentioned by The Hill, a news outlet, it is stated that according to the Stop APPI hate group, anti-South Asian slurs, slogans, and phrases have increased from about 23,000 to over 46,000 from January 2023 to August 2024. It is both astonishing and terrible that in such a short amount of time, hate speech involving this group nearly doubled. You have anything you want to add to that, Jason?
Absolutely. What even more terrifying is how these narratives keep going by fear, misinformation, and historical pattern. If you look back to the Rock Springs Massacre, one of the key factors was the scapegoating of Chinese miners who were accused of taking job and lower wage. This seemed harmful narrative pursues in modern time. Asian Americans are still being unfairly blamed during mention of economy growth. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a rising harmful narrative of falsely accused Asian American of being responsible for the virus. This expression doesn't just say online or in the media, it shows real-world violence and discrimination. It's a reminder of how dangerous these narratives can become when left unlocked. What do you think, Taylor? Do you see any other connection between the event at Rock Spring and the challenge the Asian American community face today?
Yes, today we still see these situations in the form of microaggressions. Microaggressions are comments that subtly or unintentionally express a prejudiced attitude. An example of this is when Americans ask minority groups the question, "But where are you really from?" after they have already said they are from America. They are unconsciously hinting at the idea that people of color are foreigners and are unwelcome in America, even though they were born here. We have also seen how Asian Americans have been set up as a model minority, which creates a lot of societal pressure. This follows the known stereotype where Asians are good at math and are really smart. This causes the problem where they believe they aren't good enough unless they fulfill this idea. Oh, and going back to what you were saying earlier, Jason, about COVID-19, the reason why so many people believe the virus came from China was because of the false information spread from former President Donald Trump. He went around sharing the idea of this, quote, China virus. People act on this idea because they trust the people who are in power.
Thank you, Taylor, for actually mentioning the coronavirus. As you mentioned, our former President Donald Trump, who influenced many Americans to refer COVID-19 as a China virus, we have seen a severe increase in hate crimes towards Asian Americans. It has been found that 37% of Asian adults say that they've been called an offensive name. Among that group, Asian adults born in the U.S., which would be around 57%, reported being called an offensive name, almost twice as much as Asian adults who immigrated here, which is around 30%. Discrimination also takes place in the workplace. It has been noted that 1 in 5 Asian Americans have faced workplace discrimination. No matter the being, the pandemic sparked this idea that if they look different, then they must not be from the U.S. And once again, we are back in the past where Asian Americans are facing racism and discrimination from others. And as we continue in time, the numbers only keep increasing where white people treat Asian Americans horribly, leading to the effect of these two groups becoming more and more separated from each other.
Absolutely. I agree about how our president is slowly going back into the past. I also wanted to talk about the rhetoric between the Rock Springs Massacre and current events just a bit more before we dive further into the topic. In 2023, there was a lot of discussion about the possibility of banning TikTok in the US. Politicians and media outlets portrayed the app as a threat due to its Chinese ownership, with reports characterizing it as a tool for economic sabotage and espionage. According to CNN, these discussions devolved into broader anti-Chinese rhetoric that impacted Chinese American communities and led to a revival of stereotypes about Asian Americans as dangerous or permanent outsiders. This is similar to the terminology employed during the Rock Springs Massacre, when Chinese miners were also portrayed as dangerous outsiders disrupting American life. It's truly unsettling to me that even though we as a society have been making so-called progress in America, there are still some tactics that the media still holds on to this day.
Finally, what it's showing us is that while the platform and method might be involved, and underlying issue remain the same, fear and prejudice continue to adapt and find new ways to take hold of society. Back then, it was a local newspaper spreading misinformation story about Chinese worker. Today, social media now spread diverse content and misinformation, and while the tool has been changed, the harm remains the same. It is not an easy task, but it is one of the few more taught than ever. After all, if we don't learn from the mistake from the past, and we just setting ourselves up to a repeat history.
Thank you for saying that, Jason. And yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, I do feel like that even though we are making progress as a society, there is still the same kind of rhetoric being used today as we saw even 150 years ago back in the gold rush. And it's these types of situations where anti-Asian American hate has massive harm onto the community. And even though it is unfortunate to say, it is a very real reality that these sorts of like social movements are just gonna go back to how it was if we are unable to change how things are going. But we do have some reflection questions for our dear listeners, just for you to ponder and think about how the episode was. Like, for starters, is it reasonable to say that the phrase history repeats itself is suitable here?
Another question we have would be, why do you think that Americans always want to find someone to blame for their problems?
And additionally, should people in power be held more accountable for the rhetoric they spread? But I do believe that is it for this episode with the BMW crew. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again next time where we discuss the events surrounding the murder of Vincent Chin. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Where We're From. This podcast is produced by students enrolled in Dr. Joanne Rondilla's Asian American Studies courses at San Jose State University.